Now, today we're going to start the beginning of chapter 7. So by the end of the end of the previous chapter, the avodah had gone right up to and including the Seir Azazel getting pushed off the cliff. And so now we have this next part. What was next? So the next part is actually not directly listed in the Torah. And that was when the Kohen Gadol did Kriyat Torah. He did a Torah reading. So let's see what it says. Balo Kohen Gadol Likrot. The Kohen came to read. The Kohen Gadol came to read. Im ratzah likrot bevigdei vutz koreh. If he wanted to read in the linen clothing, he reads. V'im lo koreh bi'itzlit lavan mishelo. And if not, he reads in a white itzlit of his own. Chazan HaKnesset notel sefer Torah v'notno l'rosh HaKnesset. The Chazan of the Knesset. We have to see what all these things mean. Takes the Sefer Torah and gives it to the head of the Knesset. The Rosh HaKnesset no lesgan. V'haskan no the Kohen Gadol. The Kohen Gadol omeid and mekabel the Koreh omeid. Right. So then the Kohen Gadol, when he gets the Torah from the Skan Kohanim, the high priest stands and accepts it, and he reads it standing. V'koreh achrei mot v'ach be'asor v'golel sefer Torah u'menicho b'cheiko v'yomer. So after he reads achrei mot and ach be'asor, he rolls the sefer Torah and he places it in his lap, and he says, Yoter mima shekarati lifnechem katuv kat. More than what I have read before you is written here. Uve'asur shebechumash hapkudim korei al peh. And then be'asur, that's in chumash hapkudim, which is Bamidbar, he reads by heart. And then he blesses on it 8 blessings. Al HaTorah, Ve'al HaVodah, Ve'al HaHuda'ah, right, on Torah, on the service, on the acknowledgement, on Mechilat Avon, on the pardoning of sin, Al Mikdash B'ifnei Atzmo, and on the Mikdash by itself, Al Yisrael B'ifnei Atzmo, Al Yushalayim b'ifnei atzma, v'al hakohanim b'ifnei atzman, v'al shar ha'tfilah, and on the rest of the tfilah. Excuse me. Okay, so we have a lot of things going on here. Let's go through just 1 second. Let me see if I can bring something up. Wait a second. Oh. Okay, you know what? We'll come back to that. Oops. Okay. So the Kohen Gadol is coming now to read. So the first thing it says about this, before he even reads, if he wants to read in while he's still wearing bigdei boots. So what were the bigdei boots? Which begadim were those?
They were the ones that he did for the korbanot, correct? He was wearing for the korbanot.
He's wearing specifically for Yom HaKippurim, right? Because some of the korbanot. You mean the korbanot that we described here in the Mishnah, which were specific to Yom Kippurim, right? Because he would wear the Bigdei Zahav for avodot that were done every day, right? So the Bigdei boots, the fine linen clothing, which we discussed, many times, that's what he was wearing when he was doing any avodah that was specific to Yom Kippurim. And at this point in the order of things, those are the clothes that he would have been wearing. What was the last thing that we remember that the Kohen Gadol was doing?
He was bringing the parts of the sacrifices to the Mizbeach.
No, we're past that. Oh, wait, maybe, no, are you right? Hold on a second. No, I think, maybe I'm wrong.
He did the Koteret and then he came back.
Yeah, he did the Ktoret and then he came back, but we described, hold on a second. Just a second. The last thing that we remember him doing was and the last thing he did was he sent off the Sira Mishtaleach. And this is what we spent most of Perek Shishi talking about. So if we go back and look at, hold on a second. Right, in Perek Shishi, remember the first Mishnah was just general rules about the Sira Mishtaleach, and then it said that the Kohen in Mishnah Bet, it said Balo Etzel Sira Mishtaleach v'somech shtei yadav, and he said Vidui on the Sira Mishtaleach, and then it was given in Mishnah Gimel Misaro Misha Hayam Olichot. Then he gave it to the person who was going to. And then the rest of it was about what happened to the Sira Mishtaleach. So what clothing would he have been wearing when he did the smicha and the vidui on the Sira Mishtaleach?
Probably these Bigdei boots. By the way, he has got to wait until the Sira Mishtaleach is pushed over the cliff. You remember that we asked ourselves, how would you know?
Right. Right. So the point is, when we're here at the beginning of Perek Shvi'i, he's wearing the Bigdei Lavan, which are also called the Bigdei boot, right? That's what he's wearing at this time. Just a second. Yeah. Right. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of it because of all these things that I was thinking about, and I told you. But let's go back, we'll concentrate. So when we're here, or at least I'll concentrate, you should all concentrate too, but don't mind me. So here, Imrat Tzadik wrote B'Vigdei Vutz Korei. So now, at the beginning of this chapter, the last clothing that we knew that he was wearing was the Bigdei boots. And so if he wants to read the Torah while he's still wearing Bigdei boots, then he can read. In other words, he can read while still wearing those begadim. V'imlo, and imlo what? If not what? Then he reads in an itztalit lavan mishalo. Then he reads in a white itztalit. We'll discuss what itztalit is in a minute. If not what? What's the imlo?
Imlo Ratzah.
in Loratza. If he doesn't want to wear the big day boots, he can wear an itzilit mishalo. In other words, he can introduce wearing clothing of his own. That's not, it's neither the big day zahav nor the big day lavan. He'll wear an itzlit. So now, what does this tell you about the nature of the Kriya, the nature of the Torah reading that he's going to do now? Is this part of the avodah of Yom HaKippurim or not?
No, it's not, because he would have to wear the big day boots.
If it was part of the avodat Yom HaKippurim per se, then he has to wear the big day boots, like Michael is saying. So here, it's optional. So if it's optional, so what does that tell you about the nature of wearing big day boots? If it's optional and he's allowed to wear the big day boots, so then what does that tell you about wearing big day boots?
So big day, oops, I said, what's going on here? Oh, big day boots in itself is not a marker of the avodah, but it's required for the avodah.
When you say it's not a marker of the avodah, what do you mean?
Meaning that it is in itself, it is like, if one looks at the Kohen Gadol and he's wearing big day, and he's doing something wearing big day boots, that in itself is not an indication that he's doing the avodah.
Okay,
but it's required for the avodah.
Okay, so what we see is, on the one hand, it's required for the avodah. He has to wear for the avodah, but we also see that it's optional for him to wear it even when he's not doing avodah. Right, so that would seem to be a chidush. This is something we didn't know before. Until now, we emphasized this idea that the clothing that he's wearing is going to be directly related to the actions that he's doing. And so here, we would have thought, okay, either he would wear, until now we only knew two options. Either he'll wear big day zahav or big day vutz. But if he's wearing, if he's wearing big day vutz and not doing avodah, we thought that we didn't think that was an option, right? So this Kriyat Torah comes in, and it introduces a concept that we haven't had, because until now we only thought in terms of all of the avodot, whether they're for Yom Kippurim or for every day, that are mandated by the Torah. But reading the Torah on this day is not mandated by the Torah per se. There is a limud for it. That's what there's a limud for it in the first chapter. But for the moment, we'll stick with the Makorot that are in front of us. But we know, for example, we read now through Achremot several times, and there is no indication in Parshat Achremot that he has to read the Torah. In fact, hold on. Let's just take a look for a second. What the next thing should have been after sending off the Sir Mishtaleach. What did we see? Here. Let's go back and remind ourselves. So after the smicha and the vidui on the Sir Mishtalech, which is Pasuk Kaf Aleph, then the Sir gets sent off. What does it say then? Uba Aharon el Moed ufashat bigdei habad asher lavash beva'o el kodesh v'hinicham sham. So the next thing, according to the Torah, is that Aaron is supposed to go into the Ol Moed and remove the Bigdei Habad, in other words, the Bigdei Vutz, that he had worn, in other words, that he had worn until now for the Avodah of Yom Kippurim. Bivo al Kodesh, v'hinicham sham, he's supposed to leave them there. Remember, we revisited that pasuk several times about what it meant in terms of the what it meant actually, and the order of it, and so forth, and also in regards to the usage of the clothing. There was a daya that said that the clothing could then be used for divrei chol. And then Vrachatzet B'Sora B'Mayim B'Makom Kadosh, he was supposed to go to the mikveh, the Lavashet B'Gadav, and put on his clothes. In other words, and what were his clothes? So it would be the Bigdei Zahav. Then V'Yatzav Yasa Et Olato V'Yatorah Ta'am V'Chiper Ba'ado V'Ad Ha'am. Then he has to go and finish off these other things for the day. All right, we're going to revisit these psukim again, but just to remind us a little bit of where we're holding. And the idea was that as far as we knew, he doesn't have to be wearing, or the Torah tells him at this point he should be taking off his clothes. So let's go back. So this tells us, so these few lines in the Mishnah tell us, presumably that he's allowed to read the Torah. The fact that he's allowed to read the Torah in the Bigdei Vutz tells us that even though this is not avodah per se, he's still allowed to wear the Bigdei Vutz. And by the same token, since it's not avodah per se, he can wear a chaluk. And that's also a proof that it's not avodah per se. The fact that he can wear this itztlit, this other piece of clothing, tells me that this isn't avodah. In other words, it's neither something that he has to wear bigdei vutz or bigdei zahav in order to do. So then we have this tekes, right? We have this procedure of the Chazan HaKnesset. So who was the Chazan of the Knesset? This is a question. Does anybody know where else the Mishnah uses this word Chazan?
No idea.
That's fast. Anybody else? You may have learned it. It's a Mishnah in Masechet Shabbat. Hang on a second. Oh, wait a second. Do you see? Yeah, you see this. Okay, so in Masechet Shabbat, in the second chapter, it's talking about things that you do or don't do in the lead up to Shabbat, right? So Mishnah Gimel says, "Lo yotzei hachayat b'machto samuch l'chashecha." The tailor doesn't go out with his needle close to dark. Perhaps he'll forget and go out. So the sofer doesn't go out with his writing implement, right? Because sofrim used to stick them behind their ears. A person isn't supposed to go looking for the lice and removing lice from their clothing close to Shabbat, v'lo yikra'lo or haner, and you shouldn't read by the light of a candle. Be'emet amru, in truth they said, hachazan ro'eh hichad tinokot korim. The chazan sees where the children read. Avahu lo yikra, but he does not himself read. I'm adding in the word himself. He doesn't read. Okay, we don't have to explain the last part, but what's the problem with reading by the light of a candle on Shabbat? Why shouldn't you be able to read by the light of a candle on Shabbat?
You might move it, no?
I'm sorry, say it again. I was coughing. You might.
You might move it by unconsciously moving.
Right. Not so much that we're not so worried that you'll move the candle per se, but what are we worried about? How did the neirot that used to have, you all know the kind of nair that they used to have. It wasn't like a stiff wax candle. What was it? It was like
it's like a clay oil lamp. No?
a clay what?
It's like a clay oil lamp, almost shaped almost like a pitcher.
Well, the way they were shaped, it was like a flattish kind of bowl that had a top and it had a lip, right? And you would stick the wick at the end of the lip and light it, and then it would feed from the oil in the bowl. So on a normal day, when you might be reading by this lamp, that's the word I should be using. When you're reading by this oil lamp, and maybe the wick is starting to get a little bit too short, then you're used to doing this, so without thinking, you'll just move the wick a little bit. You'll adjust the wick. That's how they would make it get brighter. So you're not allowed to read next to a ner on Shabbat because Shema Yishkach, that you might forget that it's Shabbat and try to adjust the wick. And so then the Mishnah says, but Be'emet Amru, this term of Be'emet Amru is interesting, but here it indicates that this is the way the halacha came down. The way the halacha came down was that the Chazan would see where children were reading. So the idea is that children, they were allowed to read next to a lamp. Why were the children allowed to read next to a lamp? We adults aren't allowed, but children are allowed. So what were they reading?
Well, maybe they don't know by heart their prayers, and the Chazan does know his prayers by heart.
Well, so you're associating the Chazan with the way we use it today, that the Chazan is like the Chazan who's like the Shaliach Tzibur for Tefillah. But actually, that's not what's going on here. So the Stam Kriya in this context would be sitting and reading Tanakh. And so the story that's happening here is that the children, they're reading their Torah lessons by the light of the lamp. So they're allowed to read next to the lamp because we're not worried that children are going to go out of their way to adjust the lamp so that they can read better, because in any event, that's not necessarily what they want to be doing, is sitting and reading on, their lessons on Shabbat. So who is the Chazan? The Chazan is like their teacher. He's overlooking to make sure that they're reading their lessons properly. So he himself is not allowed to read by the light of the lamp, but he can see where the children are reading. Avahu lo yikra. He can't read. He's not allowed to read. And this indicates to you, in this context, who is the Chazan? The Chazan is the person who's overseeing the lessons of the children. Here, the Bartanura, the Bartanura says, Lo yikra la'or haner, and the Bartanura says, B'sefer shem yateh haner lahavi shemen. Right? Maybe he'll adjust the lamp to bring the oil, the fi haptila, to the mouth of the tip of the wick, kadeshi lo yafeh, so that it will light properly, a light nice. And then he'll be over on making a fire on Shabbat. Even if the ner is 2 or 3 stories above him, it's always forbidden to read by the light of a lamp. Unless there's somebody else next to him who's watching him. Or if he's such an important person, that's something that would be beneath him to adjust his own lamp. That's something for the servants to do. So here, what does the Bartenu say? Chazan melamed tinokot. Chazan is somebody who teaches children. And he can see mehechana tinokot korim, mehechan yatchil likrot, from where they begin to read. In other words, he's allowed to point and make sure they're beginning to read from the proper place. Devi'iyun mu'at ki hai lo gazrinin shem yeteh, because with this minimal amount of attention that he's going to have to pay to the text, the Chazan, the Rabbanan didn't make a gzeira that he wasn't allowed to use the lamp. In other words, that much he's allowed to use the lamp would be to find the place where the children are supposed to be reading from. Batinokot korin lifnei rabban or haner, and the children can read in front of their teacher by the light of the lamp. She'emat rabban alehem, because the fear of their Rebbe is upon them. But I also think what I said is true as well, that children are not necessarily, yesh kol minei, right? So the children who want to read, but they won't adjust the lamp because they know that the Chazan, who's their Rebbe, is going to make sure that they don't, so they wouldn't, it's out of their mind. Or maybe they're not so excited about being there.
How do you understand that there is a shiur on Leil Shabbat? Because it can't be on Shabbat, you don't need the light, because you have enough light outside. It looks very strange. They should go to sleep. The children should go to sleep, no? On Leil Shabbat.
On the other hand, if it's so, first of all, yes, it would seem that this is almost certainly at night, because to have a lamp burning during the day, even if, let's say, it would be a dark room and you would need extra light, but that would
have burned out since Leil Shabbat.
Exactly. I was going to say, either would burn out, or it would be extremely expensive to keep a lamp that would be burning all that time, right? That would be a very big expense to have enough oil in a big enough lamp that it would burn all the way through sometime on Shabbat. So so that's what was happening. They had some kind of a shiur with their Chazan, and the Chazan here is their Rebbe. He's their melamed tinokot. Anyway, the reason I bring
you see that Bartenura, he didn't have electricity. He understands what's going on.
Exactly. So for us, by the way, I heard a story once about the Chazon Ish, and there was, back in the day, there was still this question about what the nature of electricity was, and I may have gotten this story wrong, but this is what I remember. So what we saw here is that a person's not allowed to read by the light of a lamp unless there's somebody else watching him, right? So if there's somebody else watching him who's not reading themselves, then it would be permitted. So I remember hearing this story that the Chazon Ish was like, he was sitting he wanted to sit and learn after, on Shabbos night. And he told one of his Talmidim to come and be his shomer, to make sure that he wouldn't adjust the light. And although now that I'm thinking about the story, I think I'm conflating with something else. I think this story had to do with an oil lamp or a kerosene lamp, that he was sitting there, Chazon Ish was learning, and then there was this like yeshiva bacher next to him who was supposed to be there to make sure that he doesn't touch the lamp. And then at some point, the Chazon Ish moves his hand toward the lamp and starts to put his hand like to adjust the wick on the lamp. And the bacher is too afraid to do anything because he says, like, it's the Chazon Ish, like he must know what he's doing. So the Chazon Ish looks at him and he says, you're not trying to stop me from adjusting the lamp. What do I need you for? And he closes his book and goes away. Anyway, Kach Shamati. But here, this is all a digression. I wanted to point out though, the use of the term chazan. So here we see that the chazan is, in this context, stam is a melamed tinokot. Right? And here the Tosfos Yom Tov says, Pirush harav melamed tinokot, v'targum ro'eh chozeh, right? The Aramaic translation of the word to see, of seeing, is chozeh. Shehu tzarich lir'ot ha'ech tinokot korin, because he has to see how the children are reading. Yashem zeh nikra shaliach tzibur chazan. This is why a shaliach tzibur is called a chazan, kama shekatuv ba'aruch, shetzarich lir'ot ha'ech yikra. In other words, he has to see how people are reading or how they're doing, how they're doing and following the tefillah, presumably. But so, what does that say about the use of the term chazan in our Mishnah? So, to go back to our Mishnah, we have the chazan hakneset. So, this is a qualified chazan because it's not stam chazan. He is the chazan of the Knesset. So what's the chazan and what's the Knesset? So first, let's take a look for a moment at the Bartanur and the earlier parts of the Mishnah. Ba'alo kohen gadol likrot parshat hayom. Right, so he tells us, what is he going to read? He's going to read today's parsha. B'vigdei boots she'avad bahem avodat hayom. The bigdei boots that he had done the service of the day in these clothes. Kore, if he wants to be wearing the bigdei boots, Kore, shumutar lilbosh bigdei kuhuna, afilu shelo b'shat avodah. It's permitted to wear the priestly clothing, even not during avodah. The bigdei kuhuna nitnu lehanot bahem. Bigdei kuhuna are given for benefit, to benefit from. In this halachic context, it means they can be there for your personal benefit, as opposed to what? As opposed to wearing them in order to do the mitzvah of the avodah of the day. So that's also what we deduced, right? We deduced that this tells us that even though this clothing is set aside specifically to do avodat Yoma Kippurim, but now it turns out that he can wear it for purposes other than avodat Yoma Kippurim. But the purpose that he's going to wear them for is presumably also a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, right? There must be a rabbinic mandate here for him to read the Torah. So maybe it still doesn't tell us that he could wear it for whatever he wants, but he could wear it if at least it's in the context of some kind of a mitzvah. Or maybe it really doesn't matter, because anything that's not mandated by the Torah itself would be considered to be for his personal benefit. So maybe it tells us a wider lesson about the Bigdei Lavan, that they could be worn for his personal enjoyment. Chazan HaKnesset. Okay, so now we're up to how the this is how the Kriya takes place. That the Chazan Knesset takes a Sefer Torah and hands it on. So the Chazan Knesset, here the Bartanur says Shamash. He was a Shamash. In other words, he was like a Gabbai. He's in the Knesset. So what's this Knesset? What Knesset are we talking about? Hold on a second. Chazan Piresh Harav Shamash. So the Tosfos Yom Tov, I'm sorry, am I sharing that screen? No, I'm not, I'm sorry. This is the same Mishnah, but I'm looking now at the Tosfos Yom Tov. Chazan Piresh Harav Bartanur Shamash. Ma Mishamesh Piresh b'Mishnah Zayin Perek Zayin Desota. This is explained in the 7th parak, in the 7th Mishnah in Sota, which we'll take a look at in a few minutes. V'nikra Chazan. Needs of the
Shel, we didn't hear you for more than a minute.
Oh, okay. So I'll go back to here. I'm reading from the Tosfos Yom Tov and his explanation of the word Chazan. Right. So this is the Tosfos Yom Tov in our Mishnah in Yoma. So in the Mishnah in Yoma, we understand that this is not the same it doesn't seem to be the same Chazan as the Chazan we saw in Shabbat, right? Because the one in Shabbat, the Bartanur explained, was a Melamed Tinokot. He was a teacher. So who's this Chazan? So here we just saw the Bartanur explains that a Chazan is a Shamash. He's a Shamash. He's like a Gabbai in the Beit Knesset. And the Tosfos Yom Tov says, we'll look at that in a moment. And why is he called a Chazan? Right? Like he's called a Chazan, like we saw in the Mishnah in Shabbat, which is the language of a Chozeh, someone who sees. He has to see to the needs of the community. So this is a different kind of Chazan. So this Chazan is it's still not the Chazan that we think of today as a Shaliach Tzibur. But this Chazan was a Gabbai in the Beit Knesset. And there was a Beit Knesset nearby, and he would be in charge then of taking care of the needs of the Beit Knesset. So in this capacity, he's going to go and get the Sefer Torah for the purpose of reading, but they're going to be reading it outside. It'll be now exactly where they're reading it, we'll talk about in a moment. But while I'm here, let me set this up for the next thing.
Is the Knesset not the Knesset Agdola, which was maybe in the Lishkat HaGazit, I'm not sure, but something like this?
No, there was an actual, no. It's a good guess. But no, there was a Beit Knesset, not in the Beit HaMikdash, but nearby. Just a second. Sota.
So they would bring in a Sefer Torah from outside.
Well, that's the thing, where they needed now a Sefer Torah. Here we go. We're going to come back and we'll look at it here. Okay. Okay, so who is this Chazan? He's, we'll come back to, try to come back to the specifics of this Beit Knesset in a moment. But just to keep with, I do want to try to keep to the flow of our Mishnah here in Yoma. It's just that this Mishnah it touches on really a lot of different things. So I'm just I'm trying to organize it as best I can. So this is one of the things, just to understand what the Chazan is. The Chazan Knesset notel Sefer Torah, but no the Rosh HaKnesset. He gives it to the head of the Knesset. So who's the Rosh HaKnesset? The Bartanura says, Al piv nechtachim kol tzarchei HaKnesset. It's right through him that all of the executive decisions are going to be made about the needs for the Knesset. Meaning what? Mi maftir, umi pores al shma, umi over lifnei hateva. In other words, he's more what we think of as a gabai. He decides who does what in the Knesset, who does the maftir, who leads the davening, and so forth. So the shamash, the chazan, is the shamash in the sense of, it's also one of the duties that we usually ascribe to a gabai now, but he was literally just the shamash who took care of the things in the Beit Knesset, and so he would have been in charge of the well-being of the Sifrei Torah, and he takes it and hands it to the Rosh HaKnesset. The Rosh HaKnesset would be what we think of as, let's say, as a chief gabai, because he's the one who decides who davens and who does what, and he hands it to him. Mishum v'nodnim Sefer Torah mizeh lezeh. So who the Rosh HaKnesset know the Skan. So we know who the Skan is. We've mentioned him many times. The Skan is the next in line after. He's the vice Kohen Gadol. He's next in line in importance after the Kohen Gadol. And then the Skan hands it to the Kohen Gadol. Sefer Torah mishum yikara de Kohen Gadol, because of the honor that is due, the respect that is due to the high priest. To show that there are these other levels of authority underneath him. So, because here, I'll tell you what it is, the Gemara here has a question. Here, because the Gemara's initial understanding of this is that the mere handling of the Torah shows that that in itself is an honor. To handle the Sefer Torah in public is an honor. And so here, who's handling the Sefer Torah? We have these people who are in the hierarchy of important people. We have people who are less important by several stages than the Kohen Gadol. So there's a discussion elsewhere in the Gemara in Baba Batra, about whether or not one is allowed to show honor, to show honor to a Talmid bifnei Rabbo, right, to a student in front of his master. And so there's some people say yes, some people say no. So here, this Mishnah seems to indicate that here you see from this Mishnah, you're allowed to give an honor to a Talmid in front of his master. The master here would be the Kohen Gadol, and all the people below him who are getting this honor of handling the Sefer Torah are being given an honor in front of their master. So it would seem to prove, according to the opinion, that you can show respect, you can go out of your way to show honor or respect to a Talmid even in front of his master, even in front of his Rebbe. So the Gemara concludes that that's actually not what's going on here. What's going on here is this is all done for the honor of the Kohen Gadol. How does this indicate the honor of the Kohen Gadol? This handing off of the Sefer Torah.
He's at the highest level. They keep bringing it up to him.
Right, and the fact that it goes through these three hands before it comes to him indicates how high a level he is. If he went and got it himself, that would also be an honor, but it wouldn't show how much above he is other people, right? And if only, so the fact that three other people who all have official positions hand it to him, and so the Chazan hands it to the Rosh Knesset, he hands it to the one who's higher than him. The Rosh Knesset hands it to the Sgan Kohanim, who's higher than him, and then the Sgan Kohanim gives it to the Kohen Gadol, right? So that's the conclusion of the Gemara here, that this is actually all done to show the honor and the respect that is due to the Kohen Gadol, that so many important people have served him. It's for their honor. So the fact is that, yes, it is an honor to handle the Sefer Torah, but the reason that these people are handling the Sefer Torah is really to show the due respect that's given to the Kohen Gadol, which again, I also think it's important for us to remember that this was done, right, even at a time when the Chachamim themselves didn't necessarily have the highest respect for that particular Kohen Gadol, right? Because on the one, let's say on the far end, we had Shimon HaTzadik, who in fact was a tremendous Kohen Gadol, and all kinds of miracles were associated with him. And he was a Talmid Chacham, and right, he was one of the Gedolei Hador for many generations. And on the other hand, we know that there were literally hundreds of Kohanim Gedolim that, you know, that went, right? I think we mentioned earlier in one of the shiurim that many of these Kohanim Gedolim bought their position, and then they didn't even live till the end of the year. So they would go through these Kohanim Gedolim like, you know, like nothing. Nonetheless, they kept in place the procedures to show the honor that is due the Kohen Gadol. And I believe that this is also reflected in certain parts of the liturgy for Yoma Kippurim, right? And when we talk about in Musaf, when it describes, and also the piyutim of Mareh Kohen, you know, there are, the idea of the Kohen Gadol is still this very important idea, because who is the original Kohen Gadol? Of course, is Aaron. And so all the Kohanim Gedolim who come after Aaron are supposed to, you know, have that same kind of honor that would have been given to the original Kohen Gadol. So this is one of the things that indicates the kind of honor that was given to them. So what's the next thing? So the next thing is Baskan no the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Gadol omeid umekabel v'koreh omeid, right? So the Kohen Gadol stands and he receives the Torah and he reads standing. So the fact that he stands at this moment indicates what was he doing until then?
Sitting.
Presumably he was sitting. And so this is also not so obvious, right? Where does he, because why? Because one is not allowed to sit in the Beit HaMikdash. So this also is the first, this is the first clear indication that this is not taking place in the Beit HaMikdash per se, right? Who would be the only person in any given generation who is allowed to sit in the Beit HaMikdash? Does anybody know?
I believe the king, Nachon?
Yeah, but not just any king. It would have to be the king from the line of David, right? We have to emphasize that. Only kings who are actual descendants of David HaMelech are allowed to sit in the Beit HaMikdash. And the reason we have to emphasize that is because we had this office of the king in Beit Sheni from people who were actually descended not from David, right? From the Chashmonaim. So they were not allowed to sit in the Beit HaMikdash. So here, the fact that the Kohen Gadol was sitting, now we know that the Kohen Gadol would never have been the king to be in the line of David HaMelech. How do we know that? How do you know that there could never have been a Kohen Gadol in the line of David?
Because the kahuna is patrilineal, and so therefore it can't. Yeah.
Finish the sentence. And therefore what?
And therefore he can't be descended by patrilineal descent from David, because the kingship is also patrilineal.
Okay, and David himself was not a.
He was not a Kohen.
He was not a Kohen, right? Just put it together, right? So in other words, we know perforce that there would never be a Kohen Gadol who would have been a Melech mi Beit David. So that would include our Kohen Gadol, whoever he is in our Mishnah here, who's standing up to get the Sefer Torah. So the Bartanur says, Omedu mikabel miklal dad hashta yoshev haba, right? So this implies that until now he had been sitting. Nimseinu l'meidim. So now we find that we learn the Be'ezrat Nashim hayakore. He was reading in the Ezrat Nashim. Di'i Be'ezrat Yisrael, because if this would be taking place in Ezrat Yisrael, the kol shekain b'makom hamikudash yoter mimena, and all the more so in a place that would be even more holy than Ezrat Yisrael, asur le'shev, right? It's forbidden to sit. Elet l'malchei Beit David hutar lahem l'shev bazara. It was permitted, nonetheless, for kings from the line of David, to sit in the Azara. King David came and sat before Hashem. We'll look at that pasuk in a moment. But yes, so this tells us, and there are actually two opinions about where he was sitting in the Gemara. The Gemara has a discussion. So we go though with the opinion that he was sitting in the Ezrat Nashim. And just a second, we'll bring up a little schematic. Here we go. Just to remind us. No. Oh, none of these are, all right. I'm sorry, none of these are the right picture, but it's okay, I'll share for a second anyway. Right, so this picture, this is the overhead view of the Beit HaMikdash proper. Oh no, I guess it does, no, it does include, I'm sorry. It's just not, it's completely not proportional. But this area down here, this would be the Ezrat Nashim. This is the sha'ar here that you would come into the Beit HaMikdash. This is the Ezrat Nashim, and then it goes up the steps to Ezrat Yisrael and so forth. So this is where, but the proportion is off because this is actually longer than what it than what it appears in the picture. Let's go back to where we were. Okay, so the Ezrat Nashim per se was not part of the Mikdash per se, right? There was this area that goes into, that precedes the entry into the area of the Beit HaMikdash is not properly part of the Beit HaMikdash. And so in that area, he would be allowed to sit down. And we can understand why he's sitting down. This poor man has been up all night and he's been working all day, right? Now it's at this point, we're getting closer to the end of the day. It's not yet the end of the day, but sometime in the afternoon by now. And he would probably be pretty tired. But now he's going to get up and he's going to read. So what does he read? He reads Achrei Mot, which of course we're quite familiar with by now. The Ach Be'asor. Ach Be'asor is the parsha in Vayikra, in Parshat Amor, Parshat Moadim, right? Eila Moadei Hashem Asher Tikru Otam B'Moadam, and then it goes through all of the Moadim. So one of them, of course, is Yom Kippurim. Bartenu says V'korei Achrei Mot v'Ach Be'asor Sheba Parshat Amor, and then, actually, before we look at the Bartanura, the Golel Sefer Torah, then he rolls the Sefer Torah up and puts it in his chek, which is either in his lap or under his arm. The Omer, Yoter mima shekarati ifnechem katuv kan, more than what I read to you is written here. And then he reads from the Parsha of Be'asor that's in Sefer Bamidbar. What's that? What Parsha is that he's reading from Bamidbar? Be'asor l'chodesh hashvi'i. Just think of what you read on any moed. After you read whatever the reading is for the day, then what's the next thing that you read? Don't tell me none of you are paying attention in shul.
I am frantically leafing through my pseudo now.
On every moed, right? You have to read the parsha of the Musaf, and that's going to be the maftir. Right? That's the aliyah from the maftir. So where's the parsha that has all the musafim? It's in Chumash Pekudim. It's in Bamidbar. It's in Parshat Pinchas. In Parshat Pinchas, it begins with the Musaf for Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, and we read that so we don't read the Parsha of Musaf of Shabbat every week. It actually begins with the Korban Tamid, right? It begins first with the Korban Tamid, and then the Musaf for Shabbat, the Musaf for Rosh Chodesh. So on Rosh Chodesh, we read all of those three. And then after that, it goes through all of the other Moadim, beginning with Pesach, about what you read for each of the Moed, what the special Korban Musaf was for each Moed. So here also, we see that the basic idea of laning a Parsha that's pertinent to the Moed and including reading about the Korban Musaf that's associated with it was something that was actually instituted already in the time of the Beit HaMikdash itself. This is what the Kohen Gadol was reading. So first he reads Achrei Mot. So it's not all of what we call Achrei Mot. It's not the weekly parsha of Achrei Mot. It's Perek Tet Zayin in Vayikra. And Uve Esor is just a little bit further on in Parshat Emor. And he just reads that one part. So he reads first Achrei Mot, and then he rolls a little bit, and then he reads Ube Asor, and then he closes the Sefer Torah, and he reads the Musaf, he reads from Parshat Pinchas by heart. So of course, what strikes you odd about that? What's odd? What, like, I don't usually encourage this sort of thing, but why is this odd?
I mean, he's doing Kiryat, in theory, he's doing Kiryat Torah, and he's actually not reading from the scroll.
He's not reading from the scroll at all. And he actually makes a statement so that people know that he's not going to be reading from the scroll. What is his statement? More than what I have read before you is written here. What is the point of that statement? And then after that, he says the Musaf of Yom Kippurim by heart. More than what I have read before you is written here. So what has he read before them?
Read from Achrei Mot and Emor.
Right. And now what is he saying? What's his declaration meant to convey?
What I'm about to read, in fact, is included in this text, but I'm not going to be reading from the text.
Yes, very good. Very well and succinctly put.
You can't see, but I'm patting myself on the head now.
So, exactly. So he makes this public statement. So we, of course, now imagine for a moment, if you were in a shul that had one Sefer Torah on any given moed, including Yom Kippur, so you would read from Achrei Mot, and then what would you do when you need to read the Maftir?
You have to change places. You have to roll it up, unroll, and change places.
Yeah, you have to roll the Torah to the place where you read from, because we don't read by heart. So there are a couple of questions here. Why is it that he didn't do that? Why didn't he roll the Torah? That's one question. And again, to bring it up to our experience, so what's the norm? What would we normally do in a shul when we have to do a reading from more than one place in a Torah?
You would have more than one scroll.
We would have more than one scroll. We would have brought out 2 Sifrei Torah, and we would read the parsha, the main parsha from the first one, and we would read the maftir from the second one. So then this raises a question, at least from our point of view, why didn't they do that in the Mikdash? Why didn't they bring out 2 Sifrei Torah? Why did they bring one Sefer Torah and read from the beginning and then read the rest of it by heart? Okay.
I'm wondering if in fact they had one Sefer Torah that was in an honored position, in some sense set the standard for all other Sifrei Torah. In some sense, a bit like sort of like in, like with any standard of measurement, there is one object that sets the measurement. So therefore, this happens to this Sefer Torah was the Sefer Torah.
So this is an interesting point, which first of all, it's an interesting speculation. The reality was that we know from elsewhere there were 3 Sifrei Torah in the Azara, and they were used as references for anytime there was a question about a particular text and how it was supposed to be written. We also know that the 3 Sifrei Torah were not identical. There were variations among them. And the way they set a standard was, if you had a question about how to write this or that word or this or that passage, you would look at all three Sifrei Torah and you would use the majority between these three. Of course, in principle, there was a single Sefer Torah that was the standard. That was the Torah, presumably, that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, which in Bayit Rishon would have sat in the Aron. But we no longer have, in Bayit Sheni, we don't have the Aron. We don't have that Sefer Torah. And yeah, that's the whole thing is an interesting story. So it was, I understand where you're going with that, Michael, but so it's not exactly true that there was a single one. There wasn't really a single one. But even if there had been a single Sefer Torah that was considered to be the most standard, that doesn't obviate the necessity to have another Sefer Torah to read from. But this brings up a lot of questions for us about what they were doing, like the nature of the way this Kriyat Torah took place in Bayit Sheni, as opposed to the way we do it nowadays. And why was it done like that then? Why do we do it like this now? Let's get a little bit of insight from the Bar Tanura here. The Bar Tanura says, "The Korei Achrei Mot v'Ach Be'asor shebeParshat Emor." That why shemutar l'daleg b'Torah b'inyan echad kishehu karov b'chdei shelo yafsik haturgaman. Okay, so remember, it tells us that the Kohen Gadol is reading, but we know from elsewhere in the Mishnah in Megillah that for every pasuk that he read out loud, there would be a turgaman, right? There would be a translator who would say it out loud or read it out loud in Aramaic, right? So you're not allowed to, so what the Bar Tanura is saying is that you're allowed to skip, excuse me, you're allowed to skip in a Torah the inyan echad, if you're staying within the same subject. When the place you're skipping to is close enough that you can roll to that place before the Turgaman finishes his verse, right? So he would have read the last pasuk in Achrei Mot, and then immediately rolled to Emor. While he's rolling, the Turgaman is translating the last verse in Achrei Mot. By the time that translation is finished, which maybe it's just a few seconds, but that, of course, Emor is very close to Achrei Mot. So it only take the Kohen Gadol a few seconds to roll there. That's permitted. So there are two Tanaim here. There are two conditions. One is, when are you allowed to skip? You're allowed to skip from one place to another when you're reading the Torah in public, if you're skipping from one subject to the same subject, which is what he was doing, right? He's reading about Yoma Kippurim in both Achrei Mot and in Emor. And what's the other condition? It can't be further away than the time it would take for the Turgaman to translate the last verse from the first parsha. Aval im kodem sheyiglol sefer Torah ad mekom hadilug yafsik haturgaman hamitargem pasuk shekara hakorei asur ledaleg v'liglol. Right. So, but if before he would be able to roll the Sefer Torah to the place that he wants to skip to, if during that time that would leave some, some dead air, right? It would leave a time when there's the Turgaman had finished translating his verse, that the Baal Koreh, in our case the Kohen Gadol, had finished reading, then then you're not even allowed to try to roll to that place. Shenimtzu tzibur yoshvim umitzapim, because then it leaves the public sitting and watching, as it were, like sitting and expectantly. Ve'ein ze kvod hatzibur. This is not respectful of the tzibur, that they should be sitting in silence while the Torah is being rolled. So that's it. So what we learn from this are these halachot, that you're allowed to skip from one place to another in reading your Sefer Torah in public, as long as you're skipping to the same subject, and as long as it's so close by that it doesn't take longer than to translate the last pasuk that you read. Because otherwise, to take more time than that to roll a Sefer Torah in public, you're leaving the tzibur sitting and waiting expectantly, and that's not kavod tzibur. So to those of us who live in the 21st century, maybe we find this idea refreshing but foreign, right? Because we've all been in situations where they're not only are they rolling through the Sefer Torah, but they can't exactly find the place, and they have to they're looking around, but we see actually min hadin, and that's a sur. Min hadin, that's a sur. Now the fact is, of course, nowadays if you're in a shul that really only has one Sefer Torah, it is permitted for them to roll to get to the maftir or whoever they need. But it's getting late. But maybe we'll just take a look at that for a second. Hold on a second.
Shel,
Yes.
isn't there a problem with their having only one Sefer Torah? Because if I remember well, at the time of Chazal, they had 5 books which were separated, and they didn't have one gvil, one single one. I think so.
No, actually, no. They had regular Sifrei Torah. According to Chazal, that was exactly also what Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. And actually, according to Chazal, he wrote 13 of them before he died. But the idea of a Sefer Torah per se, no, they had. But in addition to that, maybe this is what you're thinking, there was also a phenomenon of Chumashim, right? This is where we get the term Chumash. In that context, was one of the books of the Torah that was written as a separate scroll. Those were used for learning. People would learn from them. And especially, right, it wouldn't be that, it would be very expensive for an individual to own a whole Sefer Torah, but maybe he had enough money, he could write out Sefer Breshit or Sefer Shmot or Mashu Lo Yiyeh. But Sifrei Torah per se, according to tradition, they were always there from the beginning. Anyway, I'm sorry. Hold on, I'm trying to bring something up. Here we go. Anyway, this raises these questions. So we asked a couple of questions, and one of the questions was about reading. Right, so he's reading from a single Sefer Torah. Why doesn't he roll to Parshat Pinchas? So now we know the reason he doesn't roll to what. So now we know what is the reason that he doesn't then roll to read from Parshat Pinchas, to read the Musaf. Why doesn't he roll the Sefer Torah all the way to Parshat Pinchas?
It would take too much time.
It take too much time. And that's not Kvod HaTzibur. That's exactly what the Bartun was explaining in the Mishnah. You're not allowed to roll a Sefer Torah, even if it's B'inyan Echad. Remember, we said there were two conditions that would allow him to roll during the Kriya. One is that it's the same inyan. So the Musaf in Parshat Pinchas, that is the same inyan. So that condition is fulfilled. But the other problem, the other condition is it can't be so far away that it takes more time than the time it takes for the Meturgaman to finish translating the last pasuk that he read. So that will take more time. Even though it's not that far away, because he's now in Amor, that's the middle of Vayikra, but he has to get almost to, not to the end, but close to the end of Bamidbar. So that takes too long. He won't have enough time to read it. So Kvod HaTzibur is more important than the Isur. There is an Isur of reading Torah Shebichtav Ba'al Peh. So what is he doing now? He's going to be reading the Torah by heart. The Gemara says in Masechet Gitin, we have the famous general rule that Dvarim shebichtav eyata reshai la'omram ba'al peh. Things that are written, you're not allowed to say them by heart. You will always have to read them from a written text. Dvarim shebichtav right? Things that are Baal Peh, you're not allowed to write down. So even though ultimately that second part of the klal changes under duress, right? Because Eit Lasot Lashem Heferu Toratecha, and in the time of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, it was taken, they took it upon themselves to write down the Mishnah. That's a separate discussion. But the first klal actually never went away, and it stands today. That's why we still read Parshat HaShavua from a Sefer Torah that a Sofer wrote. It's not just to keep me in business. It's that in order for you to be allowed to read Divrei Torah in public, you have to read it from a written copy, and a written copy in this context means something very specific. It has to fulfill all of the halachot of k'tiva, and that's what sofrim do, right? That's part of what it means to be a sofer. So let's say a printed copy technically doesn't qualify. That's a separate. It's also a little bit of a separate discussion. And it's an interesting discussion, but I don't have time to get into it now. I want to finish this off. So this is what I want to, this is the main thing I want to point out, that what's going on here is exceptional according to rules that were in place at the time of Bayit Sheni. That is, even in the time of Bayit Sheni, it was understood that one does not read or say or recite by heart psukim from Tanakh unless you're reading from a written copy. So what the Kohen Gadol is doing here is exceptional. And that's why he makes an announcement. He makes an announcement to say, more than what I have read is written here. And exactly what he accomplishes with that announcement, I think we'll examine that a little bit more next week, because I'm going to stop now. But that's part of the reason that he has to say it. He has to make sure that you understand that what he's about to recite by heart is in fact written here. I'm not just making it up. It's something that's written in the Torah. And even though I'm not going to have the psukim right in front of me when I'm reading them, but you should know that what I'm about to recite to you is written here. You know what, we'll stop here and I'll look at this next time. If anybody's interested, if you just want to see the halacha, it's in, if you have a Mishnah Brura, it's in Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Siman Kuf Mem Daled, about the halachot of Kriyat Torah. It's an interesting siman. You can look at it there, and I'll bring it in next time. So I think that's it for today. Any comments, questions? Okay. Have a good night.
Night.
Thank you. Good night.
תודה רבה, יישר כוח.
Baruch
Feel
Tiyeh.
better.
Bye-bye.